Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live coding session for AWS Innovate. My name is Gabe Hollenby. I am a technical evangelist here at AWS, and I'm sitting here in our Singapore office. And today, for the next hour, we're going to cover some live coding related to GraphQL and AWS AppSync, which is our managed GraphQL service on top of AWS. Let's just get going. First, I don't have any slides. I'm just trying to focus with code as much as possible for this time. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to shout out in the chat. We have moderators standing by. I also have a colleague sitting here in the room with me named Sean. And if I miss any questions that seem particularly great or relevant, or if Sean thinks I should pause and explain something, he'll interrupt and ask me some questions. So if you hear another disembodied voice, it's Sean just sitting off camera here. Cool. Hi, Ronka Patel, 1685, and hello, Clementine, 28. And the Razor is Sean, I believe. Cool. So let's get going. What are we going to build today? So if you look on my screen here, what I've got is an example of what we're going to get to by the end of the hour. It's going to be a simple web app. I'm going to build it in React because I like React. And what it's going to do is just do a simple event management, just a simple CRUD app. So it's got authentication. Oops, it helps if I type my name right. And once we authenticate, and we've got the normal sign up to create an account or forgot password, if we forget, and once we log in, we get a nice little loading screen, and then it pulls out a list of existing events. And we've got a simple form at the top where we can create another event to add to the list. And we've got a little title bar at the top where we can click sign out to sign out. That's it. It's pretty simple. So let's get going. This is what we'll work towards. Again, the goal of this is not to teach you how to build beautiful looking apps with React. It's to focus on an introduction to GraphQL and using GraphQL with AWS AppSync. And also we'll leverage the AWS Amplify JavaScript library to make a lot of this really easy. So let's get going. Our first step should be to just create a simple Hello World React app. So let's do that. I'll call it Innovate Events. And this shouldn't take too long. I think Create React app is a wonderful way to start your React projects. If you're looking for an opinionated way to get started, I think it's one of the best things out there. Okay, so what's this going to look like now? So let me go ahead and shut down my old server where I had the completed project of what we were trying to build. And now if I come here and I just do npm start, let's see what we get. Cool, right? So this should be no surprise to anyone who's worked with Create React app before. This is the stock standard Welcome to React splash page that you get when you first build. And it even tells us to get started, we just want to edit the source app.js file. And we've got hot reloading on here. So if we save the code, it'll automatically refresh here in the browser. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside source, we'll edit app.js. How's that font size? Let me know in the chat if you need the font size to be any bigger or smaller. Let's get rid of the things we don't need. So we definitely don't need this logo. We're probably not going to worry about the styles, but I'll leave that app CSS in there. We can get rid of all this other stuff. We don't even need the class name for now because I'm not going to worry about styles. And let's just change this to Hello Innovate. And if I save that and we come back and look, it's there. So that's great. That's a nice spot for our first commit. We have a working Hello World app with a nice way to get started. So let's initialize this Git repo. Let's make a commit. Cool. Now I'm happy to start sharing this code online as we go through the rest of this live coding session. I'm happy to take a suggestion for what we should call this app. I was thinking maybe just calling it Innovate Events like I did here in the command line. But if somebody on Twitch has a different suggestion for what we should call this repo in GitHub, let me know. I'm happy to take the first reasonable suggestion that comes through the chat. Okay, so I'll wait for that suggestion to come in while we keep going, and I'll just push before sometime, after my next commit or so. So again, that's it. At this point, what we've done is got our little hello world up. At this point, it's just a stock standard React app. We haven't gotten into any AWS, anything yet. Are there any questions from the chat? All in for React. Sure, we can call it that. Why not? And while I'm doing this, if anybody has any questions so far, please just drop them in the chat. I'll make a new GitHub repo here. I'm just going to prefix it with Innovate so we know that this was from the Innovate repo or Innovate conference. And I should just need to do this. Okay, so now we can all follow along as we go, and the repo will be there afterwards if you want to look at any of this code. I gave the reactor. I like that, Randall. Too bad. All in for big data beat us to the punch there. Okay, so at this point, let's go ahead and do the next thing. Before we even get into GraphQL or anything, let's just add authentication because I want to show how easy that is. Now, you don't need authentication for your apps, but it's something I think a lot of us will end up using in our apps. And the AWS JavaScript Amplified JS library makes adding authentication to your JavaScript web apps really, really easy. So there's a number of ways to get started with that, but the one that I think makes it easiest is to actually use AWS Mobile Hub. So we have, and you should see that in the quick start, if we look at the docs, we're using a React app, and so you can see here, we basically followed this, and then it suggests installing the AWS Amplify library. I'm actually going to go one step further and use the AWS Mobile CLI, which, because this is a React app, it'll automatically add Amplify when I initialize this using the mobile CLI. So I've already done that. I've already configured it. So I can go ahead and just, I can say AWS Mobile init, and it'll add a bunch of helpful tooling for this repo. So AWS Mobile init. And all of these defaults are completely fine for the Create React app for what it sets up. And I don't mind leaving this default name. Okay, so what happens behind the scenes here is that the AWS Mobile backend, the Mobile Hub is another service that we have in AWS that makes it easy to add different types of backend capabilities or cloud capabilities to your mobile apps, including authentication. If you're using authentication with AWS, you're probably going to use the Cognito service, which is our user identity and app data synchronization service. Let's also just see what region it created this in. We can see that it put this inside US East 1. Cool. So here we go. What this has made for us, I'll just go to Mobile Hub here so we can see it now. Once we've done init, it created a project for us called Innovate Events. And by default, it's got hosting and streaming. So I can just type AWS Mobile publish right now, and it'll give me a nice deployed web app to S3 with CloudFront CDN in front of it, so that I get nice point of presence, faster downloads for my viewers wherever they are anywhere in the world. And then I'll also add a service called Amazon Pinpoint for doing event tracking for my app if I need to do that for things like authentication and login. Now, I can use the web interface here to add other things, like, for example, authentication or whatnot, but I like using the CLI. So let's go back to the CLI here, and I'll just do that. So let's add AWS Mobile user sign in, enable, and I'm going to say -p because I want to provide some options to that. So I'm going to go to advanced settings, and I'm going to go ahead and just use Cognito user pools. If I wanted to, Cognito supports federated identity sign-in from popular providers like Facebook or Google or other OIDC or OpenID Connect providers, as well as enterprise SAML providers as well. But for the purpose of this stream, let's just stick with a standard Cognito user pool, which will be a place where users can register with their own username and password. That's what I would like for this demo. Instead of email, I'm just going to ask them to provide a username and a password minimum length. 8 is fine, but I'm going to turn off all of these. These are good practices, right? Normally we want to require uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special characters. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to turn those off so I don't have to remember whatever complicated password I end up choosing. And now if I just say AWS Mobile Push, it will take that new configuration and add the user sign-in feature for my backend. And what this is really doing behind the scenes, without me having to understand a lot about the intricacies of how Amazon Cognito works, is it's going to provision a Cognito user pool for me to manage all my users that sign up. And it's also going to add the information about that to this AWS exports file, which is what the Amplify JavaScript library will use to load its configuration. And so now that we've done that, if we go and we look at the Amplify documentation, instead of the quick start, let's go look and see about authentication to see how easy it is to add. So you've got a number of different cloud features, and the one I'm interested in is authentication. Now, here we can see that, yes, we want to use Amazon Cognito, so we can follow these. We've already done user sign-in enable. We've already done push. So now, all we need to do is import Amplify and auth from AWS Amplify, import our AWS exports config from this file, and then tell Amplify to configure itself with the config that we imported. It's pretty much just that simple. So let's go do that in our app. And then we can customize a number of sign-in options. You've already seen me do that. There's a manual setup, which we don't have to worry about here. Okay, so now we're working with the API. Now, if we weren't using React, or if we wanted really tight control over all the different steps of signing up, signing in, forgetting password, etc., we could build our own UI and just use these different methods off of the auth object here in order to affect the behaviors we want. For example, auth sign in, you can see how, and confirm sign in, and you can see what the structure of these API calls are. For sign up, we would pass this information in to the auth sign up call, etc. But because we're using React, down here in our docs, we have using the with authenticator higher order component. So for React and React Native apps, of course, we're using React. We can make our lives even easier by also adding the with authenticator higher order component and just wrapping the app that our app React class with authenticator. We've got a question.
So All In for Big Data asks, what is the fundamental difference between Auth0 versus Cognito?
So I haven't used Auth0 in production, but I know people do find that it's a useful tool to use for doing sign up and sign in for their apps. I would say the nice thing about Cognito is there's really tight integration with AWS services, and I can show a little bit of that in the stream. So, for example, now that we've done that, if we go back to our mobile hub and I refresh, you can see that user sign-in is also here. If I click resources here, we get a list of all the resources that Mobile Hub is currently managing on our behalf, including the Cognito user pools and identity pools. So when users use our React app, they're going to log in and then get temporary credentials to access all of the AWS resources on our behalf. And Amplify manages that behind the scenes for us, but it's a nice best practice. And the cool thing is we can really lock down exactly what the users can or can't do in our app by, if we look at the identity pool, which is where we'll get the IAM role, we can see here that for, let's see, we should have an authenticated role here. Okay, it's set to use default role. If I have more time, I'll go in and I'll configure this later, but you can go in and we can tune what specific IAM privileges the user will have when they log in to our app. So let me come back to that. But I would say if you use AWS and you need authentication mechanisms or even just getting temporary credentials for unauthenticated users, Cognito is a service to use. I hope that answers your question a little bit all in for big data. So watch how easy it is to turn on authentication with this higher order component. So I'm going to add the with authenticator higher order component to our import, and that comes from AWS Amplify React, and I haven't imported anything from that yet. So we'll add that, and then, hang on, missing my escape key there. So we'll just wrap this, and I'm also going to add one other directive here, an option called include greetings true, and that's going to go ahead and give us that title bar at the top that says welcome with the username and gives us the sign up button. So now that I've just done that, if I refresh our app, here it is now asking us to sign in. Now first thing we'll need to do is sign up because we haven't created any accounts inside this user pool yet. So I'll say Gabe, and I'll put in my super awesome secret password. And I'll put my email address in. I don't have to put a phone number. I can if I want to, but it should be fine just to add email. And when I click sign up, it's going to hopefully send me a confirmation code. No, it does want a phone number. Okay, cool. So let me add one here. It's not going to SMS me because it's going to use my email address, so it shouldn't really matter what I put here. Great. So it's asking me for a code, and this code is going to be sent to my email address. So let me just go ahead and pop my email open in another screen without bothering to spam you guys. Actually, I'll just pull it off my phone. Just hang tight for a sec while we wait for that to come in. Okay, I got a code from Cognito, and it's just an email. It says my verification code is 244387. So I'll just type that in. And this is Cognito confirming that I have access to the email address I used when I signed up, right? And the important thing there is, now that I've confirmed that, I can use the forgot password feature if I want. So now I should be able to sign in with that password I just made. And there we are, back at our app now. Hello, Innovate. So with basically one line of actual code and a couple lines of imports, right, we were able to add sign in, sign up, forgot password features to our React app. That's pretty neat. Any more questions right now? Cognito user management as a service, I see as a question here in the chat. Yeah, so Cognito it can act as user management as a service. That's with the user pools feature. And it can also act as just a user authentication using federated identity providers like Google or Facebook or other OpenID Connect providers as well. So if you don't want to have users create new credentials, you can use Cognito to authenticate with those other identity providers. But if you don't mind having your users, or you do want to manage your own user credentials as well, that's what the Cognito User Pools feature is for. The include greetings flag is all that does is let me get this sign out button at the top, and it says hello with my username. And you can see that we can look inside the documentation here so there's more about federated identities, which we're not working with here in this particular case, but there's also a rendering a sign up button section of the documentation. So it says here, right, with Authenticator, the component renders your app after successful user signed in, prevents non-signed in users to interact with our app. If we want to display a sign out button, then we just add include greetings true. Okay, so moving on, let's go ahead now and get to the real meat and potatoes of this presentation, which is using GraphQL and AppSync. So what's the best way to do that? Well, first, let's just talk about GraphQL in general. And to do that, I'm going to enable the AppSync for our app. So AWS Mobile, AppSync, enable. And I'll say AWS Mobile push again. Now, what this will do is it will create a new API in AWS AppSync. It's also going to provision a default example schema for us. I think when you're first getting started using new technologies, it's much easier to see working code and play with it a little bit rather than having to read a ton of documentation just to get started. So when I'm explaining AppSync and GraphQL to people, I like to start with an existing schema. And luckily, the team behind AppSync thought similarly, and so you don't have to start your API with a example schema, but in this case, it's a good way to get started. And in just a second, after it's provisioned everything and reconfigured, we'll be able to pop into the AppSync console and see what that schema looks like. Okay, so back into AWS console land instead of here. Let's go back to AppSync. So you can get to AppSync by searching for AppSync here in the AWS console. You can also type GraphQL. There's a number of ways to get there. And there is our API. So you can see here, let's just start with the schema because this is the interesting part. What we have here is a simple schema for managing events. So there's two basic data types in this example schema, a comment and an event. Let's just start with events, right? The idea behind an event is it's a piece of data that has an ID, which is this data type called ID, which you can think of, in this case, it's just going to be a UUID. And events have a name, a where, a when, and a description, and we're just storing those all as strings. Now, for an event, you can ask for comments, and when you ask for comments, you can give it a limit or a pagination token, or I should say a key set pagination to get the next set of comments for a particular event. Comments are simple. They have an event ID that they belong to. They've got a comment ID for themselves and a created at timestamp. We're probably not even going to worry about comments for the duration of the stream, so not so important. Now, for the rest of this, I want to look at it from the outside in. So if you're completely new to GraphQL, let me stop for a second and explain what it is and the best place I think to learn more. So one place is to go to graphql.org/learn. And this is where I started when I was getting started learning about GraphQL. In short, I like what they say here. GraphQL is a query language for your API and a server-side runtime for executing queries using a type system that you define for your data. Right? It's not tied to a specific database or storage engine, and is backed instead by your existing code and data. And that's a really key point here. So I think a common misconception is that GraphQL has something to do with graph databases. It doesn't. You can use graph databases. You can use GraphQL to get at data in graph databases, but GraphQL doesn't care. GraphQL is just a specification that says, I'm going to make it, I'm going to create a formal contract for the way the client is allowed to ask for information from the server and the way it's allowed to mutate information on the back end. That's all GraphQL is. And there's a spec for how the clients and the server should communicate with each other. And it all starts with the schema, right? This schema is our strongly typed description of all the different types of operations we're allowing for this GraphQL API. All GraphQL schemas have this root node called schema. This is in the spec. And inside that schema, you're going to at least have queries, but you also might have mutations and subscriptions. And those are pointing to these different data types, query, mutation, subscription. So let's first look at query. If we look at query, we can see there's two queries that we have in our schema right now. One called getEvent, and this takes an ID, and this is required. So the exclamation mark means it's a required attribute. And that makes sense, right? We shouldn't be able to say getEvent and ask for an event without giving it an ID. And the data type we get back is event, and we've already seen what the shape of that data looks like. Another thing we can do is we can call list events, and this has an optional limit argument and an optional next token argument. Limit should be an int, next token should be a string, but since there's no exclamation mark next to these, we can see they're not required parameters. And what we get back is an event connection. What is an event connection? Well, we can go up here and look. Event connection is just a data type in our system, in our schema, that says I have two values. Items, which is a list of 0 or more events, and a next token value, which is a string that you can use to paginate if you have more events than whatever the first query is going to give you back. And we can see that in action. We can go ahead and start interacting with our API. But before we do, let's just cover mutations really quickly. So there's two mutations in our, there's three mutations available in our default schema. Create event, this is the one that's most relevant because this is what we're going to use in our stream. So create event, we must pass it a name, a when, a where, and a description. And those are all strings, and we know they're required because of those bangs there. And we get back an event for that. We can also delete event by passing its ID, and we can also comment on an event by giving an event ID, some content for the comment, and create it at a timestamp. So let's not worry about subscriptions just yet. Now that you've seen that schema, we can go ahead and interact with it. Now, if you have used GraphQL before, you're probably familiar with a tool called Graphicool. Graphicool is a nice interactive query explorer and runner. And we have something very similar right here in the AppSync console. And so if you've never seen GraphQL before, the way you get started is you basically just use you're going to type something that looks a little bit like JSON, and it's following a similar structure to what you have in the API, in the schema. So, for example, we can see that I can start with a query, and here's a documentation browser on the right, and then let's say list events, right? So I can say query, and then we have autocomplete here too to help me with my messed up typing. So I can say I want a query, and the query I want is list events, and I don't have to pass any arguments. Now, the other key component of GraphQL, and this is what I think is really nice about it, especially for mobile applications, but for web apps too. The client is responsible for saying what data it wants back from the queries. So in our schema, the list events query gave us back a list of events, and each event had different attributes associated with it, right? It had name, description, where, when. But when you ask for events, you can specifically say, so I care about the items from list events, and inside there, which I know it's a list of events, I can say I only care about the ID and the name. Now, if I run this, I won't get back any items because there aren't any in my data source yet, right? That should make sense. We started out with a fresh API with a schema, but no data. So before we go on, let's go ahead and mutate and add some stuff to our events. So I'll also give this query a name. I'll just call all events. And that's nice because you can have multiple queries or mutations here inside the editor. And using this play button, if you have multiple ones, you can pick which one you want to execute. So I'll make a mutation, and I'll call this new event. And the mutation I want to run is create event. And that takes a number of required fields, a name, a where, when, etc. I'm going to put these on different lines because I find that reads better for me. So name, let's call this AWS Innovate. When? Well, today is 2018/7/19. The where is online. And a description. Happy to say live on Twitch. Now, mutations also need to specify what information they want back. Remember, a mutation gave us an event back. It's the event that it creates. So we can just say, I just want the ID back. If I run that mutation, we can see that it worked, and I got back a new ID. So very simply, if I come back down here and I run the all events query that I made, and I can use the keyboard shortcut, so I can come here and I can pick it from the button. There, now we've got one, right? And remember, we only asked for ID and name, and so that's all that came back from our query. If we needed more information, like description, for example, we can add that, and then we get that back. So the nice thing here is we're never overfetching. We don't have to decide ahead of time, that the shape of our data in, let's say, a traditional, REST API. You fix what your resources look like in certain endpoints, and they're that way forever. And if you decide you need another field, or the name of the field needs to be changed, you've got to have some back and forth with your API team. But with GraphQL, you've got the schema defined ahead of time, which again doesn't tell you what you get back. It tells you the maximum amount of data you could get back if you wanted. Looking at our schema again, right? We could ask for up to ID, name, where, when, description, and comments for an event if we want to, but we don't have to ask for all that data if we don't need it. So now that we've gone and interacted with the API a little bit, I should say from the console here, do you have any questions before we move on and actually integrate this into our web app? I'm happy to see if there's any questions here on the chat. While I'm waiting for questions, I'll just show you one more thing. How is this data getting stored? This kind of seems like magic, right? AppSync also has a concept of data sources. And you have several options for data sources here. In this case, the default schema is using DynamoDB. And we have two tables inside DynamoDB, one for our events and one for our comments. And we can just click here to go directly to the DynamoDB console and look at that particular table, and we can see, oh, look, I even typed live wrong. We can even see all the data that we have here. In this case, it's just one row right now. But that's where that's getting backed. If you don't want to use DynamoDB with AppSync, you've got a number of options. I'll just show them here. So DynamoDB is great for NoSQL data sources. If you have more complex querying that you need to do, or perhaps fuzzy searching or geo restrictions, that kind of stuff, you can query directly into Elasticsearch as well from Amazon. So if your data's in there, you're good to go. Your cool escape hatch is AWS Lambda. So you can use Lambda to resolve data requests from AppSync for a particular data type. And once you're in Lambda, you can do anything you want, right? You can call out to a traditional RDBMS that perhaps running inside RDS, MySQL or Postgres or Aurora. Or you could look up some hard-coded data in a file. You could hit some other API. That's up to you. Very recently, I believe just yesterday, maybe the day before yesterday, we added HTTP endpoints as another data source. So this is really cool, and it basically lets you take existing REST APIs that are out there in the wild and teach AppSync how to forward requests onto them for particular data types and fulfill them. So you can more easily leverage existing REST APIs, but sort of GraphQLize them with less effort than having to wire that all up yourself. So that's how that works. Let's do one more thing while we're here. Let's change the settings so that instead of API key authentication, oh, it's already set to authorization type IAM. Okay, I want to make it Cognito user pool, and I'll do that back here in our AWS Mobile. I'll just configure this. And I'll say that I want to use user pools because I think it'll be nice. And it already knows what user pool to put in here because I'm doing this inside of an existing AWS mobile initted app. And US East 1 is correct. And the default there is fine. So I like this because what it'll let me do is it'll let me have access to the user ID, the username of who authenticated in our app when we're interacting, not Git push, AWS Mobile push, when we're interacting with our AppSync API. And this will make more sense in a minute if we come in and we look at some more advanced details. Now that that's done, if there are no more questions, can this app be deployed as AWS Lambda is a question. Sort of. We don't need to deploy it as AWS Lambda. So traditionally, what you would do is, I would say, you'd have your API that you might build with, let's say, Express if you were working with Node, and you would deploy that to Lambda, and you would front that with API Gateway. But for using AppSync, you don't have to do that, right? Our API is managed by AppSync. That's our GraphQL endpoint that will point Amplify to in our app. So serving our app will come from S3 when we publish it, and the API, the dynamic data, will come directly from AppSync. I hope that makes sense. ASIF 912. Subscriptions do require long-lived connections, beep, beep, bop, bop, and they're powered by WebSockets under the hood. And if we have time in the rest of the stream in the next 20 minutes, I hope to show you a subscription in action as well. All right, let's go ahead and get to the fun part, which is wiring this all together. So, Amplify, again, has a nice solution for working with all kinds of APIs, including REST APIs and GraphQL endpoints. So if we go back to AWS Amplify documentation here, and we look at working with GraphQL, and there's a few things we have to do to get started. First, we just have to set up a little bit of configuration, which should already be done for us, and it's just the same line. And then after we've done that, then we can use the GraphQL client. See, configuring for AppSync should be done automatically for us. I don't think we'll have to do anything else here. We did already run these commands, so we should be good to go. So using the GraphQL client inside Amplify. It's as simple as this. So just like we wrote a query directly in the Query Explorer in the AppSync console, you can have a string. This is just a multi-line string using the backticks in JS. So you can have your query here as a string. And then if your query ends up needing parameterized values, you can put them through with a format like this, where you give the parameterized values with their data types here in parentheses, and then you pass those data types down to the appropriate fields for the query as it expects them down here, and then the rest of this looks exactly the same as what we did in the console before. So how do you execute that query? Very simply, you just say api.graphql, and you pass it a value. That value is the result of using this GraphQL operation with the query represented as a string. And if that query has parameters that you need to pass in, right, that like this get event example does up here, then you pass that as an object. So GraphQL operation takes a string, which is your query string, and a second optional argument, which is the values for your query that it needs to parameterize. It turns that into something that you can pass to this api.graphql function. But it's even easier if you're, or it's not, it actually doesn't get any easier than that, but there's another option as well. We have some existing React components, and the one that is pretty nice for loading data is called Connect. And so I'm going to use this for just showing our data at first. So let's get this into our app now. So we're going to import Amplify and GraphQL from AWS Amplify. We already have Amplify up there, so we just need to add GraphQL operation. We don't need this line. And we were going to take Connect from AWS Amplify React. We already have with authenticator there, so we can just add Connect there. And here's a nice example. And we should just be able to copy and paste this. I'm going to tweak it a little bit, but this documentation will work very nicely for our example here. So let's replace our render with the following instead. So what we've got in render now is a simple list view function, or I should say it's a list view component, a function component that just renders. It takes events in, and it's going to say all events, and for each event it's going to map out, and it's going to put the ID and then the name. It's going to put the name and then the ID in parentheses, and it's using the ID as the key property here in React, so React doesn't complain to us about having list items that all have the same key. There's our query, list events. And I'm just going to indent that a little bit because I think that reads nicer. And I'm going to modify this a little bit. I think this is a little bit hard to read, and I also want to just add a little bit of capabilities to it that showcase some of the features here. What's happening here is that this Connect higher order component expects us to give it a function, and it's going to basically call this query when our React component loads, and when the data is available, it's going to pass it down to our function inside an argument called data. And this example code here is doing two levels of destructuring. It's saying I expect something called list events inside data, and I'm going to work with that here to render out the list view. I'm going to try and make this a little bit easier to read by pulling out some of this. I'm not going to do two levels of destructuring. And I'm going to show off some of the other features here. We also have errors, and we also have a loading flag. And we'll do, instead of a single expression, we'll do multiple expressions here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, if our loading flag is true, then I'm just going to return a div that says loading. Cool. Next, why does it not like this if here? Let's see. I must have mistyped something here. We've got a function. Oh, yeah.
You're missing this curly bracket.
Yeah, I don't need that one.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so if we're loading, I'll just return loading. Next, I'll say if I have any errors. Now, errors will always exist. It's going to be an array, so I have to say if the length of the errors happens to be greater than 0, then just to see any errors with my query, I'll just JSON. This is just for my development purposes. You might do something a little bit nicer in reality, but I'll just stringify my errors so I can see them on the page. Finally, I'll say if we don't have any data on list events, then I'll just return because the data might not be ready yet the first time the DOM loads. Finally, if I do, I'm good to return my list view and pass the events in, but they'll come from data because I'm not doing two levels of destructuring now, I'm doing one. All right, that was a lot of code changes, but let's go back and let's see what our app looks like. And there it is. So I'll refresh in case you don't believe me, and it's working. So, I don't know if you could catch that in the stream, but I'll refresh again. It does say loading for a little second. There you go, and then it loads. So that's working. Pretty great. I'm going to go ahead and make another commit right here because we've done a lot and we haven't made a commit in a while. Just so you can see what we've changed. Just a few things here, including adding AWS Mobile here. It's safe for me to just add all of this. Actually, there are some keys inside this config, inside my AWS Mobile config that points to different identity providers. This will work. From a code perspective, it'll work. I'm going to go ahead and delete one of the resource that I've created in AWS afterwards. So I'll just show you what I'm talking about. So remember I mentioned that all the config stuff is inside AWS exports. So for example, it's teaching it where this identity pool is that it should talk to for Cognito purposes. We've got the AppSync information in here, etc. So afterwards, I'm probably not going to leave this AppSync API running in my AWS account forever. So these things just won't work, but that it's not going to break anything for you guys from a code perspective. It's just going to you won't be able to run this code as is because some of these values will need to change. I hope that makes sense. But it is safe for me to commit this. So I'll just do a commit here and say added AppSync with AWS Mobile. All right. Now that we've rendered some content from GraphQL in our app, I'll just pause again and see if there are any questions about this before we go on. Do I recommend using ReactQL? Asks All In for Big Data. I don't know what ReactQL is, so I can't recommend it because I don't know what it is. Is it clear to put comments after items in the list events? Asks NG Nagithu. Let me see. Clear to put commas after items. Okay. You don't need to put commas. You totally can. That they're white space. Commas are considered white space in GraphQL. So if you like the commas, you can put them. It shouldn't have any effect on our app. Let's see. No, still works. So you could put the commas, but you don't need to. Could I guide put all keys in env, please? Okay. Could I show you how to put all the keys in the environment variable instead? No. For the purposes here, when you're using AWS Mobile Hub and Amplify, the idea is all of the config gets managed for you through this AWS exports file, and that makes it a lot easier to use everything that Amplify has to work with. So they're all going to come from here. Can API Gateway filter invalid GraphQL requests before hitting other layers? API Gateway, well, we're not using API Gateway here for AppSync, right? We go directly to an AppSync endpoint when we communicate with AppSync here from our front end. I'll show you. This is the endpoint it's hitting. So it hits my AppSync API ID .appsyncapi.uscs.amazon.aws.com/GraphQL. As far as we're concerned, API Gateway isn't in the picture at all. It's just going directly to this GraphQL endpoint. React.js or Angular? I like React, so I'm going to say React is the answer to that question. But again, there's Angular is valuable too. It's not a religious stream.
Hey, Kites ask is that how would you put access restrictions on data in GraphQL? Okay,
so that's a long answer that I'm not going to have time to get into in the stream in the next 10 minutes. I want to show our mutation and stuff. But the short answer is, if we look at the AppSync documentation, I'll just pull some of that up for a second. I could have gone straight to the docs. If you look in the docs, we have some really nice documentation on doing both coarse and fine-grain access control. So under security here, both at this top level and these authorization use cases, there's a lot of different types of security you can do. I'll just show one example in particular before we go on, just so I don't punt your question entirely to docs. You can add AWS auth. These are kind of like annotations. You can add these to queries, for example, and say, if you're using Cognito user pool authentication, you can say which groups of users should be allowed to access particular mutations or queries. And you can do more fine-grained access control as well. I just don't have time to get into that in this stream. Okay. But I hope that helps. Cool. I'm hearing a bell ring outside my room. I'm just going to go ahead and ignore that for now and hope that it's not the building burning down. Yep, okay, it stopped. Cool. So either the bell burned down or we're all okay. So let's go ahead and let's add a mutation here so you can see that in action. And I'm going to try and go really quickly because I've got about 10 more minutes.
Your attention,
hang on,
please.
I'm just muting my mic here.
Thank you.
Okay, I just got an automated announcement over the PA that they're investigating the fire alarm that went off, but they'll let us know if it's something we need to worry about or not.
We are investigating the situation.
This is what I call a hot stream.
Please remain calm and stand by for further instruction.
All right, let's go ahead and add some mutations to our app. So,
Ladies and
in
gentlemen,
the interest of time,
your attention, please. The fire alarm has been activated.
I'm sorry that you're still hearing the
We are
announcement.
investigating the situation.
I'm just going to type for a second without talking.
And stand by for further instruction. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. The fire alarm has been activated in the building. We are investigating the situation. Please remain calm and stand by for further instruction. Thank you.
Okay. If you can hear me on the stream, you can see what I've added here in the interest of time, because I'm a little bit slowed down from this fire drill here. I've just pasted in a simple event form component as well. So this is just a simple React component that's going to keep track of a name, description, a where, and a when. They'll start as empty strings. And just reading the rest of this backwards, what we'll see is when we render this, we're just going to render some inputs, name, description, where, and when. We're gonna, whenever those values change, we'll pass it to this handle change handler. And then we have a button down here called add event that we'll call the add event handler. Handle change is pretty simple. We're just going to capture, we're gonna start with an empty object, and then we're going to set that object's key to whatever the name was from the HTML form element, that the input element rather, that triggered the event, and we'll capture its value there for the value. And then we'll use setState to update that particular name value pair inside this class, or sorry, inside this component. Our add event mutation is going to look exactly like what we were doing in the console. So we're going to do a create event, but we're templatizing this by passing in the variables here. So we're saying I have a create event mutation that takes name, when, where, and description, and that passes those values down to name, where, when, description here for the create event mutation in GraphQL. And I'm going to ask for an ID, name, where, when, and description back from it. So here I am actually doing the mutation. I'm going to say API.GraphQL and pass the GraphQL operation here, which is create event, along with the state, right? So my variables that need to go into that that mutation will come from this event form's state values. If that works, this is an asynchronous operation, so I'm going to await the return. Then I'll log it to the console, and we'll clear out our state and ready to add another event. So finally, all I need to do is add my event form to what we're rendering from our app, and I'll have to wrap both of these inside of another div.
Scott Evilman would like you to push the fire alarm event into the app.
Well, let's make that for our next event. I think that's a really great idea.
Alright.
Okay.
Gabe's going to do another one this afternoon, and we'll definitely get some fire alarm.
API is not defined and list events is not defined. All right, I have to import API from Amplify also. And then what line is list events complaining about 86? Let's go look at that with some live debugging. That should be data.list events. I undid that by accident. Cool, so now we've got our form. Let's see if this works. The event name, fire alarm. Description, will it stop or is this really a fire? Where? AWS. When? I'm just gonna type now.
Present.
And I'm gonna click add event. Oh, but wait, let me open up the console because we haven't turned on subscriptions yet, so we're not gonna see it automatically show up in our UI. Okay, let's click add event now and see what happens. Cool, it says event created, and we've got some data back here. So assuming that worked, I'll just close the console now and refresh. There it is, cool. So that's working. So that's how easy it is to add a mutation to. Hopefully that made sense. I'll go ahead and make another git commit right now showing that. Yeah, that looks right. Added, creating events mutation and form. All right, so we've seen how to query and mutate. Lastly, I think it would be nice if I just showed subscriptions in the 4 remaining minutes. So let's see if we can get that done. Looking at our documentation again for subscriptions, for using GraphQL client back here in Amplify, we can see queries, we can see mutations, and we can see subscriptions. So subscriptions works really similarly. We're going to mention the subscription that we want, and then we're going to say we're going to use the GraphQL API as well.
They're disabling the lifts, apparently.
Oh, really? Okay, awesome.
Make sure you commit your code.
Code has
The
been
code will be
committed.
lost during this
Code has been committed and pushed, everyone. Don't worry. So the we're working with this as simple as calling API.GraphQL with the subscription. Just like before. Subscriptions can also have parameters. For example, in this example code, it's subscribing to comments about a particular event ID, but we don't want that. I just want to subscribe to anytime somebody creates a new event. So let's go back to our schema and let's change that really quickly. So the sample schema is subscribe to event comments, but we're going to change this to say just subscribe to events. That doesn't take any parameters and it returns an event. I'll say subscribe to event. And that will be, instead of that, we're going to say create event. So this is the format you do. You use this AWS subscribe annotation here. And what we're basically saying is when this create event mutation fires, trigger anybody who's listening to our subscription that we call subscribe to event, which will return an event because that's also what this returns. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go ahead and save that schema. Cool. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and bring some code directly in. So we're going to add a subscription and an on-subscription message to our connect component here. So connect can also handle listening automatically to the subscription events and updating our, re-rendering our component when it gets new data. So I just need to make sure subscribe to new event and handle new event data exists in my function. So let me bring those in as well. So subscribe to new event. It doesn't matter what I call it up here. Here, I just need to make sure it's called the same thing in my schema. I think I called it subscribe to new event. I just called it subscribe to event, sorry. So subscribe to event, and I'll pull all of that information back from it. Handle new event data, okay. I'll talk through this code in a second. First, I just want to show it in action, so hopefully this works. Let's see. All right, if this works, when I create a new event here, we should just see it without having to refresh. So subscription test. Here we go. Doesn't matter what we type here because we're not rendering that stuff anyway right now. Ah, cool. We have an error. Let me see if I can debug this. Although I've only got one more minute here that I'm supposed to be on stream for. So I probably don't have time to debug this. I'm sorry, everybody. The fire drill totally threw off my pacing a little bit. Might need to change new event to event in a few places. Yeah, thank you. Let's look for that. That one is fine. Subscribe to new event there is fine. Subscribe to new event there is fine. That should say event though. That's right. Yep. Good catch. Thank you, Tech Nanner. That should be all we need to do. Actually, let's try this again. Okay. Another subtest. 2, foo, bar, baz. Let's see if that worked. I must have missed a spot. Scott Evilman, thank you for your kind words. Look, I'm going to be redoing this same stream later today. I'm going to go ahead and sign off for now because I need to turn over the stream to whoever's streaming next. But I do want to say thank you to everybody for this. If you want to see the final version of this, I'll fix whatever syntax error I have that's going on right here, do another push into this repo, and you should be able to follow up with that asynchronously to see a working sample of what we've tried to cover in this stream. And again, if you want to catch me actually hoping getting subscriptions working live on stream, come back again later today. I'll be reprising this session later. Thanks everybody for being really supportive. I really appreciate it. It's been fun, and build on.